All right, looks like we've got all sorts of people still joining in, and that's likely going to be the case as we get underway. But in the interest of time, wanted to kick things off. My name's Skip Newberry, President and CEO of TAO, and welcome. As part of our diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging initiatives, we just wanted to start off by acknowledging the indigenous land on which TAO is headquartered. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, and many other tribes who have made their homes along the Columbia River, creating communities and summer encampments to harvest and use the plentiful natural resources of the area. So we take this opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land. So we want to welcome you all to our legislative session preview. This is for 2021, and we're excited to share our legislative agenda and the ways you and your company can get involved. In terms of the pronouns that I go by, typically he, him, his, and TAO's president and CEO. I'm going to be joined today by fellow staff members, Kara Snow, who's our Chief Community Engagement Officer, as well as Justin Martinez, who's our Events and Programs Coordinator, and both will be providing back-end Zoom support. Before we get started, all participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a TAO staff member unmutes you and calls on you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or direct messages to Kara or Justin, and we'll monitor the chat box and respond throughout the discussion. We also ask that you all engage via the participant icon on your screen. And we also are going to be using a tool called Mentimeter, which we think is a lot of fun. We have allotted time for audience Q&A. Using this tool, you can access the Q&A by scanning the QR code on the screen or by visiting menti.com, that's menti.com, and using the voting code 1459020. We'll share access details when we reach that portion of today's program. And we'd also like to encourage you to please engage with us on social media during the call and throughout the day. We love to share what's happening at TAO and get participant takeaways from our events. One item to note in the spirit of transparency is we have a member of the press attending today's call. Pre-submitted questions and those submitted by Mentimeter have been anonymized. Before I introduce Rachael Wiggins Emory, TAO's lobbyist and vice president at Thorn Run Partners, I want to provide some context regarding TAO's legislative priorities. So one of the big areas we've been focusing on this year and that our board back in November had us really kind of hone in on was innovation and digital transformation. Essentially helping companies in the private sector, but also public and education sector institutions become more resilient in the face of constant change and economic disruption. And we've also been really focused on something called economic competitiveness. So essentially the ability of the ecosystem to support really innovative companies and make them successful. And so with Oregon's ability to compete for tech companies and talent, that's now top of mind for many of our members. Since the onset of COVID and the acceleration of remote work trends, people can live and work wherever. And we also saw with COVID the importance of tech infrastructure in enabling the delivery of things like economic opportunity, learning, healthcare, and also government services. And it's never been more apparent how important the tech infrastructure is. Tech infrastructure is also vital for every resident and business in the state, and improved access to education, training, and employment opportunities in tech, one of the sectors that thrived during COVID, is also vital if we're going to succeed in the future as a state. In the wake of flawed data privacy legislation in California, the Pacific Northwest, namely Oregon and Washington, have a chance to get it right. And these are just some of the areas you'll hear Rachael talk about today. The tech sector has weathered the COVID storm relatively well, but as a region, we're not attracting the talent, capital, and companies at the same rate as other tech hubs with a high quality of life and favorable business environment. Notably in the West, Denver, Boulder, and Austin, Texas are really growing at a fast clip during COVID, attracting a ton of investment and seeing a lot of business growth. We're facing headwinds in terms of tax policy. It's contributing to an increased cost of living and of operating a business in the region. And many of our members are growing, but they're doing so by hiring and investing outside of Oregon. So with that as background and context, I want to introduce Rachael Wiggins Emory, who's going to go into some detail on some of the legislative measures that we're going to be tracking and some of the policy areas that we'll be paying attention to in the 2021 legislative session in Oregon. Rachael, floor is yours.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Skip. As Skip mentioned, I'm Rachael Wiggins Emory. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a vice president at Thorn Run Partners, which is the lobbying team for the Technology Association of Oregon. As of today, we are 1 week away from sort of the beginning of what is probably going to be an unprecedented long session. So I wanted to use this time with you all to sort of walk through three whats. What do we know going into session? What does TAO care about the session? And then what can TAO members and tech companies do to get involved? I am going to do a lot of talking at you. I know that we have Q&A at the end, but I'll also sort of stop a couple of times throughout just to see if folks have any questions, because it is, a lot of dense information. So what do we know going into session? For the structure for the session, for those who aren't familiar, on the House side, it's made up of 60 legislators. This session, Democrats once again have a supermajority with 37 members. This is important because it means with a supermajority that they can pass tax raising measures, which need to start on the House, without Republican support. Yesterday, in addition to new members being sworn in on the floor, Speaker Kotek was elected to a 5th term as Speaker of the House, so she'll be leading on the House side. And for those of you who were paying attention to the news, there was an initial sort of threat of a Democratic challenger, but that has been resolved internally. On the Senate side, we've got 30 legislators. Democrats also have a supermajority there with 18 members. For both chambers, I do want to note that while they have a supermajority, they don't have a quorum-proof majority, which means that in order to conduct business on the floor, they do rely on Republican members being present. This is important if you remember in both 2019 and 2020, the Republican walkout denying quorum and slowing or halting business of the legislature. On the Senate, President Peter Courtney was elected president and has been in that position since 2003. So it's not a surprise to you all. We've all been sort of operating in a virtual world for a very long time now. We are entering a very unique format for session. Sort of the big pieces have been agreed on, but we believe there's still sort of the nitpicky nuts and bolts of passing bills through the session, through the building, that will still sort of come as we figure out how to do a remote session. But the presiding officers released a capital operations plan, which stated that session would be remote, most likely at least through March. The Capitol will be open to legislators, and some authorized staff will be called to the floor as needed. And this is because neither chamber is allowed to vote on legislation passing it through the floor remotely. They do tie opening the building to members of the public, and members of the public also include lobbyists, to Marion County's sort of risk assessment. Right now it is in the highest level based on the governor and Oregon Health Authority's assessment, and we won't see folks back in the building until Marion County moves to a lower level. I do want to note that for committees, both the Senate and the House adopted rules on how committees would be treated in the session. On the Senate side, they said that committees can be moving legislation through committees can be done remotely, which means that things will not move as slowly as we feared in the past. Still waiting to find out what's happening on the House side, but all of that to say, we are working in a remote world, at least for the initial few months of session. One of the things that me as a lobbyist, legislators, and I know the public is struggling with is how do we sort of do the informal aspects of session in a remote world? Yes, a lot of work gets done in committees, a lot of work gets done sort of face-to-face meetings with legislators, but one of the things that we rely really heavily on is sort of the informal settings, the work that gets done in the hallways, the opportunities to bring folks to the building where they can walk into their legislator's office, interact with a member of staff, potentially get a meeting with a legislator, those sort of casual opportunities to really connect both with legislators and colleagues. That is going to be a struggle as we figure out what the world looks like in a virtual session. And I know that legislators in particular are really valuing and prioritizing transparency and access in this session, wanting to make sure that people feel like they still can connect with their legislator, can still express concerns with legislations and things like that. So that's sort of the structure for session. I think people are entering session with some concerns. We've never done this before. No one has done a virtual session before. I think people are asking for a lot of flexibility and understanding. As TAO's lobbyist, I'm working with TAO just to be very clear that I know what I know, and I'm also very aware that we don't know a lot going into session and that things can change. So I just make sure to flag that. So the timeline for session, as I mentioned earlier, new members were sworn in on Monday. House members are sworn in for two-year terms. Senate members who were up for election in November are sworn in for 4-year terms. Roughly 2,000 bills were introduced and first read on the floor and will be assigned to committees, which begin on Tuesday, January 19th. There's a couple of important deadlines to flag just for the process of session. On the 23rd of February, it's the deadline for introducing new bills. That means between now and February 23rd, members can introduce any number of bills beyond the 2,000 that have already been introduced. So TAO and its members should anticipate sort of a rolling number of bills that will be relevant to them as tech companies, employers, Oregonians. And then on April 23rd, that's the deadline for first chamber work session. This means that that's the deadline for bills to get out of their committees, either have already had a vote on the floor or be headed to the floor for a vote. For those bills that are successful in their first chamber, they have a deadline of May 28th for their second chamber work session. And then on June 18th is target sine die, which means that's the date that legislative leadership is working towards ending the session with constitutional sine die on the 27th. So session starts January 19th and can go all the way up until June 27th. Right now, working days are Monday through Friday. As we get closer to the end of session, typically that extends to a 7-day work week. Only other thing I'll flag on timeline is that there are several committees that aren't subject to these timelines. Those committees, most notably, are House Revenue and the Senate Finance and Revenue Committees. Those two are the committees that consider tax policy for the state. I just like to flag that because that means tax legislation can pop up at any point throughout session, and we keep a close eye on that, recognizing that it can impact member organizations. So legislative priorities. What do we know that the legislature is prioritizing this session separate from what TAO is prioritizing? Obviously, COVID-19, both sort of the impact to Oregonians, to Oregon businesses. I think vaccine distribution is going to be a huge issue. We've seen all the stories about states, including Oregon, being sort of behind where we'd like to be at this point. Economic assistance and recovery. We know that individuals and businesses were badly hurt by COVID-19, especially low-income individuals who are struggling going into this pandemic and are struggling even more. So we're looking at both social services supports for individuals and then sort of economic development, loan, wraparound supports for businesses, especially small businesses who have been negatively impacted. Wildlife recovery and sort of rebuilding. I saw a lot of bills around sort of building code issues for the rebuilding of houses that were decimated by wildfires. I think along those lines, there's also emergency preparedness. The legislature for years now has had a lot of conversations about sort of the big one, the big earthquake that's coming. But 2020 taught us that there are lots of different types of natural disasters, and making sure that we take the lessons learned from this 2020 pandemic, as well as the devastation from the wildfires, to really make sure that the state is as resilient as possible moving forward. Housing continues to be a huge issue. Obviously, there was the eviction moratorium that was extended through June, but housing has always been an issue in the state and continues to be separate from sort of the devastation of the last year. We'll continue to see police and criminal justice reform legislation. There's actually some subcommittees from the judicial committees focus specifically on these issues, really elevating them within the legislature. As always, access to healthcare, but 2020 really taught us about the value of telehealth. That's something that TAO has championed in the past. We will continue to be supports on that work, especially for rural Oregonians and in the behavioral health space that really lends itself nicely to telehealth. And then there's a bit of a funding gap from Medicaid that will be a big topic of conversation for the session. Along those lines of sort of technological access, we've got remote learning, and there's a big emphasis on increasing access to broadband for Oregonians, especially rural Oregonians. We've heard from the Senate president that the legislature most likely will get pulled into this conversation around the safe reopening of schools. The governor announced before Christmas that she was essentially leaving it to school districts to decide when to go back. And I think that has caused both concern and joy, and that legislatures will get pulled into that discussion. There is a huge conversation happening around redistricting with the result of the 2020 census. They are constitutionally obligated to have this discussion this session, and that's going to take a lot of legislators' focus and time. We've got campaign finance reform legislation that will place limits on campaign contributions. There's conversations around Measure 110 and the budget impacts. For those that aren't familiar, approximately $250 million in marijuana tax revenue is going to get diverted towards Measure 110 implementation, which creates a huge budget hole. In the last week and a half, we saw a press release from the House Speaker around elevating the issues of BIPOC Oregonians. I think that that's going to be a theme throughout all the legislation that passes through that building, in addition to some BIPOC specific bills. And then we've got some procedural changes coming from the 2019 and 2020 walkouts. We saw bills that create a penalty for unexcused absences, that change quorum requirements for both chambers, all the way to essentially stripping an elected official of their role with 10 unexcused absences. I don't know sort of the appetite level for passing those legislations, but I did want to note that that is something that's included. And that very long list is on top of sort of the standard role of the long session, which is passing a 2023 budget that right now has an $800 million shortfall, which I think leaving the short session, if you had said that we were going to be looking at a long session with an $800 million shortfall, people would be really concerned. But back in May, we heard numbers as high as $3 billion. So I think people are feeling a lot better about where the budget is for this session. Additionally, there's the standard conversations around revenue, taxation. It looks like there's going to be a couple of bills with minor adjustments to the corporate activities tax. And then we'll be looking at bills from legislators that failed to pass in previous sessions, whether that's because of sort of the walkouts halting business and really slowing down the ability for a lot of bills that had support and were on their way to be passed out of the building to get passed, or that just didn't pass muster in previous session. That is a lot of information. I know that we're going to have a big Q&A at the end, but I figured I would pause here very quickly and just see if anyone had questions about sort of the procedure for session and sort of the overall priorities of the legislature. I'm seeing a question that is, how possible is it the next session, given what Rep. Neerman did? Could the next session be interrupted by those that intend to take extreme measures? I mean, I think we saw on Wednesday that anything's possible. The legislature is not, the Capitol is not a stranger to protests. I think in years past, while they have been large, they have been relatively peaceful. With the exception of the one for the short session where, folks did damage to the Capitol. I think it'll be really important to see what happens at the national level between now and the inauguration. And I think that I think the legislature is prepared, and I think we should all be prepared for sort of extreme violent attempts at the Capitol, at least in the near future. I have a lot of hope that those are flukes and that we can go back to peaceful protesting. But I do think that we saw that anything is possible, and we can't rule anything out. All right. If nothing else, I'll go on to, so what does TAO care about this session? I think Skip did a great job of sort of laying out the big picture items. My focus is really going to be around increasing the profile of Oregon tech companies in the legislature. We're coming off of a really great board meeting with the TAO board, who were really engaged and energized around the notion of advocacy and increasing TAO's presence, quote unquote, in the building in a virtual world. And I think there's a lot of really good storytelling to be done around the work of Oregon tech companies. When people aren't familiar, when they think tech, they may think, white men in Portland. And I think TAO has proven that that is not the only story of tech in Oregon, and that there are amazing companies and amazing people doing great work in the state and doing work that can be really beneficial to legislators. So in addition to increasing the profile of tech, we really want to position Oregon tech companies as a resource for legislators and agencies. This means bringing content experts. I keep talking like we're walking into the building. This means virtually bringing content experts to legislators, reaching out as bills are discussed, doing a series of informational meetings with legislators, really increasing the profile, focusing on their specific districts to make sure that they're making those sort of one-on-one connections with the constituents that can be helpful to them as they do the work. In terms of actual legislation, the things that TAO is going to be prioritizing, the first is sort of around this equity of technology, and I spoke to this in the legislative priorities. We want to increase access to telehealth for Oregonians. There's a lot of bills around sort of ensuring that telehealth services get reimbursed, which is sort of the first step to encouraging the use of telehealth by providers. In order for telehealth to be available, you need to increase internet access. So focusing on broadband and increasing that for especially rural Oregonians, and then increasing access to career and technical education programs. I think the tech community for a while now has been talking about the importance of growing their own and really ensuring that we've got a good pipeline for tech sector within Oregon schools. We're seeing a lot of bills around career and technical education, really increasing access to programs, making it a part of graduation requirements, requiring the Oregon Department of Education to include it in its educational plans, things like that. TAO has been supportive of that in the past and will be supportive of those bills moving forward. I can let Skip talk about this later on, but TAO will also be working to support this notion of innovation in the state of Oregon. That'll be done through the Business Oregon's Futures Commission. They have a report with a list of recommendations that'll be coming out in March. A lot of that is focused in Business Oregon, but TAO, since they've got a lobbying entity, will be doing sort of that footwork, reaching out to legislators, really trying to elevate the importance of innovation within the state. And then specific bills. So I'm sure you are all aware that there was a big consumer privacy task force that has been meeting for the last year or so. This is a bill that started out, this is an issue that started out a bill in 2019. TAO, as well as other tech organizations and business entities, successfully turned that bill into a task force run by the Attorney General. TAO has sat at a central table for over a year now. That central table is, at that central table includes other business associations, the Oregon Business and Industry, as well as consumer advocates and privacy advocates, really working to hash out the complicated issue of consumer privacy, looking at what Washington did or is working on, looking at what California did, and really encouraging the AG to not go down that pathway, looking at the European model, discussing what conversations are happening at the federal level, really working to develop a good, strong policy. I will note that there's not going to be a bill this session. Unfortunately, after these conversations, obviously COVID slowed everything down. We had been meeting in person. And then the AG got back legislation that unfortunately just didn't reflect the conversations that happened in the work group. TAO and other members successfully sort of lobbied for that legislation to get pushed to 2022 so that further conversations could happen, with the goal of really building consensus legislation within the group, as well as creating an opportunity for us to see what Washington does. You know, they've tried to pass consumer privacy legislation a couple times now. I think they're getting close, and it would be great if a good policy came out of that state that we could sort of build on and create sort of a Northwest collective of policy, rather than having Oregon be an island out here on this issue on their own. From that work group, we are going to see a contract tracing bill. It has not dropped yet. It sounds like there's still some negotiating happening with partners, but TAO has been involved in those conversations as well, and hopefully we'll be able to support that legislation whenever it comes out in the session. Additionally, there's going to be a bill on right to repair, which was introduced in 2019 and is back this session. Representative Noss introduced it in 2019. Representative Salmon is leading that work this year. The bill has been narrowed to just laptops and cell phones. And for those that aren't familiar with right to repair, it essentially just requires manufacturers to make available information and tools for diagnosing, maintaining, or repairing equipment. I think some member companies have some concerns around sort of the issue of proprietary information and the potential for increasing sort of consumer data breaches, since you're essentially giving the ability for someone to access someone's private and personal data. So we will be working with a coalition of folks and Representative Salmon on that bill, just to make sure that our concerns are addressed. There are several bills around sort of recycling and recyclability. Created 2 bills, again, one from Rep. Solomon and one from DEQ, creating end producer responsibility programs, essentially putting the responsibility on manufacturers, producers around paying for programs to either have their goods recycled, or if they can't be recycled, sort of pay into a system to mitigate the cost to the waste streams. 2 sort of big issues that we saw out of the city of Portland are going to be coming to the state, which is a facial recognition ban, both for private entities in public spaces and for state agencies. For those who are sort of paying attention to the city work, those passed at the city level. And so NTAO worked very closely with city government on those issues. So we'll be looking to work with the legislature on those as well. I will note that there was a conversation around facial recognition being included in the consumer privacy bill, but the sort of the central table agreed that facial recognition and other sort of biometric issues are large issues that are hard to sort of tease out on a one-on-one basis, and that there were so many other pieces of the consumer privacy legislation that it didn't necessarily make sense to add on yet another complicated issue. And then we're going to be looking and hopefully supporting a bill on sort of workforce modernization. It's a bill that's being brought forward by the 9 workforce boards, really focusing on transparency and accountability in the delivery of workforce services. Skip has a meeting with the folks next week, and we'll have more information there, but hopefully that'll be in a place where TAO can be really supportive. As always, we're tracking employer issues. Representative Holvey has introduced legislation around independent contractors and sort of the tests that agencies do to determine whether a worker is an employee or an independent contractor. I will flag that sort of a big component of that bill is the presumption that an employee is a worker. A worker is an employee, and then it is for the employer to prove that they are actually an independent contractor, which is a shift from the normal practice. We'll also see a return of changes to the non-compete agreements that we've seen in previous sessions, and then some tweaks to the family leave law. And finally, sort of this big issue of taxation. I mentioned before, there's going to be modifications to the corporate activities tax. There's always conversations around sort of the connection or disconnection to federal tax provisions, things like that, that will really impact both individuals and corporations. So that's a lot, overall, we're really going to be focusing on increasing access through technology for folks, and then sort of issues that impact corporations and tech entities in both regulation, taxation, employer issues, things like that. And again, I will pause if there are specific questions on that. Otherwise, I can dive into very quickly sort of what members can do to be involved.
Hey, Rachel, why don't we dive into what members can do? And it looks like we've got a couple of questions that have been captured in chat that we can maybe get to a little bit later.
Great. What
Cool.
Members can do is what shouldn't take a lot of time, and it's really helped me. I know that Skip, Kara, and Justin can talk more about sort of how to be helpful to TAO, but as TAO's lobbyist, my lens is, how can member organizations and tech companies be helpful in the building? And it really is as content experts. So I meet with the TAO's advocacy meeting every month when those meetings occur. After this conversation, I am going to send a list of bills to Skip and the team for them to review, provide feedback on, share concerns, suggest amendments, things like that. And that's really the role of the advocacy committee, to assist in the review of bills and provide helpful information, at least during session. As I mentioned, more bills are going to get introduced, so those will be continually brought to that advocacy committee. And I'm really relying on that group to provide helpful feedback, to raise questions. As a contract lobbyist, I like to joke that it's my job to know the top 10% of everything. And so I'm not an expert in this issue, and really rely on the expertise of TAO and its members to ensure that the legislation that's passing through the building is actually beneficial and doesn't have some unintended consequences or intended consequences that are harmful to businesses. I do want to note that that's also invaluable to legislators. They have to take actions on what will be, potentially 3,800 plus bills this session, with a very wide array of topics, and they're only going to know what they're told and what they have time to find out. And so it's really important that we bring the expertise to them, whether that's in the form of one-on-one meetings, whether that's sort of more structured advocacy, where we get a group of folks together to talk about a specific bill or a specific issue that's relevant to their committees. I'll also note that at some point legislators get really tired of hearing from me, and really value and prefer hearing, if not from their constituents, at least, a quote unquote real person who's an expert in an issue and can help illuminate what they're working on. And I think that's it. That was a lot. Apologies for just sort of talking at you for a while, but I'm really excited for the Q&A and happy to answer any questions.
That was great, Rachel. Thank you. And yeah, we'll take all questions. If folks want to throw them into chat, Justin, or into Mentimeter, we're gonna be switching to that that portion of the program now. And Justin also is going to include a couple of questions that were submitted to chat earlier into Mentimeter. So that's what we'll be shifting to next. And then we'll start answering questions. All right, so one of the questions we got from the chat was with respect to data privacy, and if Oregon wants to compete globally and standardize with what the global standards are, why not just adopt GDPR in Europe, which was passed a few years ago? And that's a really good question. I do know that in terms of the data privacy work going on with the Attorney General's office, they are looking at a variety of other states, but also data privacy regimes that extend beyond Oregon and beyond the US. So there's been a lot of questions around how different countries are, for example, approaching COVID and data privacy as it relates to contact tracing initiatives. They've also had a number of conversations about GDPR-like legislation that's been passed in other places in the world. And if there's indeed a sort of movement towards a set of global standards or principles that we may want to incorporate in whatever comes into an Oregon piece of legislation in 2022. So yes, I think that GDPR is definitely something that they're looking at. I don't think it'll be adopted wholesale necessarily. And I think that a lot of companies, our members in particular, are really hoping for something that, in the absence of federal legislation, if we can align with at least some blocks of other states so that there's some consistency and alignment, it provides a greater amount of certainty and standardization, one jurisdiction to the next. And then the other question was about, does TAO check in periodically when formulating a position with organizations like the League of Oregon Cities? And yes, I talk pretty consistently with Mike Cully over there, as well as some of his legislative team. And we've been doing a lot of joint programming over the years. So a couple of years ago, we did a summit jointly on the topic of 5G and also small cell and issues around permitting standardization across the 200 plus jurisdictions in Oregon. And we were able to, out of that summit, get to a point where about a year later, there was some model code adopted by a number of the jurisdictions that helped to standardize at least the permitting side of things. There's still an open, unresolved question around pricing standardization. And I think a lot of local municipalities want to have the freedom and flexibility to set their own prices. So that was an example where we brought together industry, so telecommunications and firms and ISPs, with a variety of city officials and representatives from throughout the state. And we see an opportunity to continue to do work there. Mike also has a very interesting background, and he himself came from some companies in the past that had a big tech component and worked in companies that had focus around new mobility solutions and innovation. So he's been a great partner in that work.
Skip, I'll also note that both in session and outside of session, I, as a TAO lobbyist, sit at a lot of tables that sort of other member organizations are at as well. So there's a tech lobby that has sort of a diverse array of folks, not just your necessary standard tech companies. There's also a business lobby that has every business organization that has representation down in Salem. We meet on a weekly basis. Other members of my team are at sort of city and regional lobby focus tables that discuss sort of a wide array of issues that could impact specific jurisdictions. So between myself and my colleagues at Thorn Run, we work really hard to make sure that if there's an opportunity for TAO and its members to partner with other organizations on relevant policy, that we, sort of have our ear to the ground or are involved in those discussions. Skip, would you like me to read this question that is on my screen?
Yes, that'd be great.
Great. Do we expect the state to approach any legislation around cryptocurrencies and distributed ledger technology this session? I have not seen any legislation along these lines. I think in previous sessions, there were bills that started in what was House Economic Development on these issues. I think that committee has sort of pivoted to prosperity and recovery. And so I think there's just a lot of focus, especially just this session around COVID-19 and the recovery from 2020. And if something's coming, I haven't heard it, nor have I seen a bill for it. And again, do you anticipate any cybersecurity legislation this session? There had been data breach bills in the past few sessions. Again, I haven't seen anything this session. No one has reached out to me, at least on this issue, nor have I heard discussion. But I know that people are also aware of Skip as a person, and so perhaps Skip has heard from someone on this issue.
Yeah, I haven't heard from anyone either. And I mean, to Rachel's point, though, there's no limit on the number of bills that can be considered or introduced this session, and it's open season until February 23rd. So you never know when something might pop up between now and then.
I will also say that I think just recognizing the realities of last year, there's a sense that sort of everyone is a bit behind on the work that they're doing, or at least that's what I'm telling myself, as I'm a bit behind in the work that's being done. Typically by now we would have heard, well, typically before the bills drop, we would have heard a lot more about sort of draft bills out in the world. People would have started stakeholder meetings passing around their legislative concepts. And I think everyone was just delayed. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's a sort of a host of bills that come before the 23rd that we would have typically known about before session started.
And one thing that Rachel mentioned earlier too was some of the work that we're doing, like with the Oregon Futures Commission. So that was convened in August. There's a group of about 30 or so people across philanthropy, nonprofits, private sector, entrepreneurs, investors, as well as academia. And the desire there is to create a 10-year innovation plan for the state. The group was convened by Business Oregon, so its sort of scope or purview is a little bit more narrow. Business Oregon does a lot of work with the Growth Board, which does have some responsibility for access to capital issues and investments. So access to capital is one piece that there's a lot of room to maneuver. And then also Business Oregon has some say now with the new Office of Broadband, or the Broadband Office that was created, that's under Business Oregon. So there's some public broadband infrastructure that falls within that. And then there's also a lot of talk around access to talent, and then things like tech infrastructure and policy innovation. And so to Rachel's point, the plan that'll be proposed in March is going to be looking at predominantly early stage commercialization and startup work in partnership with universities, and how can that part of the innovation system be made better. But there's obviously a lot of other issues that comprise an innovation system, such as things like digital transformation of existing companies and sectors, things like access to talent, which is a different agency than Business Oregon. And also there needs to be more of an approach longer term that's holistic, that involves multiple agencies at the state level, multiple research universities and other higher ed institutions, and also multiple sectors in the private sector. And so that's what we're going to be continuing to kind of push the needle on, not only in this year, but in future years, is painting that broader picture of what the innovation economy and ecosystem looks like. And that includes both research and data, but also storytelling, to Rachel's point. So one of the biggest areas that we can kind of get more people involved is helping to tell your individual story as a company or a technologist, in humanizing technology, both who's involved, but also the positive outcomes that can be achieved with technology in the state. So those are a couple of things worth underscoring in terms of Rachel's presentation earlier. Okay, so can you compare the state government attitude and support for technology businesses between Washington State and Oregon? All right, so yeah, I would say there's not a ton of distinction necessarily. This is just my personal opinion that I can see between sort of what we've seen in Washington State and Oregon. There's, in terms of some of the university systems in Washington, they've had a longer sort of focus with some of the larger tech companies like Microsoft in particular and University of Washington. They've got a little bit of a head start around really effective commercialization efforts with startups. And that's been, I think, a boon to Washington, at least at the local level in Seattle, as well as with the state. One more recent development that's intriguing is their focus on regionalism, and specifically the Cascadia Innovation Corridor. So this is a largely Microsoft and former Governor Christine Gregoire-led initiative. So the president of Microsoft, Brad Smith, partnered with the former governor, and they built up this sort of Northwest ecosystem, if you will, or relationship with British Columbia, Vancouver, Seattle, Washington State, and Oregon, and Portland and Eugene, essentially the I-5 corridor, are included. And there are some folks from like OHSU and some other bigger players in Oregon that are involved, but we haven't had the same level of public sector representation in that effort at the state and local levels, as has been shown essentially by Washington State and British Columbia. And so a lot of the center of gravity around initiatives, including transportation modernization, innovation around healthcare, are largely a Washington, British Columbia story. And I think there's a big opportunity for Oregon to play a bigger role in some of that effort. So that's one example where they're doing some more both promotion of the region, as well as looking at strategically what are sort of strengths that extend across British Columbia and Washington, and how can they further invest in those. So there's an opportunity for Oregon, I think, should we decide to take it. All right, so what are some of the legislative policies that have made some of the states you mentioned at the top, like Colorado, so successful in creating a fertile environment for tech? That's like a separate session entirely. Well, we did a tax study a number of years ago where we commissioned a report from IHS Markit that looked at Oregon compared to, I think it was Utah, Colorado, Texas, Washington State, and maybe Arizona. And what we found in that comparison, and it's outdated, obviously, so more has happened in the intervening years, but we at the time didn't have the same sort of support for like an R&D tax credit. We didn't have nearly as many angel investment tax credits. So a lot of those states have in place mechanisms by which you can mitigate high capital gains taxes or just capital gains liability in general if you invest a percentage of those proceeds into a local business. So it creates this kind of virtuous cycle if someone has capital gains liability in the state. There's also some other tax-related incentives. Arizona's had a pretty successful, I think, angel tax credit program. In terms of corporate taxes, income taxes, capital gains taxes, those are some of the ones that were singled out where Oregon didn't look so good relative to some of those states. And I believe Oregon Business and Industry recently did a study too that found that since the passage of the commercial activities tax at the state level in Oregon, I think we've slipped from 40 something to we're now in 19 or 20 in terms of taxes. So that's on the corporate side. And then at the local level, at least in the Multnomah County area, there's been some concern with member companies about more income taxes, as well as a commercial activities tax locally. And so those things compound. And when you've got different jurisdictions locally, as well as at the state level, all adding more taxes without a sort of holistic picture of what's the impact on households, what's the impact on certain types of talent, what's the impact on businesses, you end up with an issue of an uncoordinated sort of tax policy. So Those are some things that are rising to the top that we're looking at from a competitiveness standpoint. And the study we did a few years ago is a good basis to start from, but more work needs to be done. And obviously there needs to be consideration for the public sector's need for revenue to support all the amenities that attract and retain talent. And so we need to also, in addition to making this connection that was mentioned in the chat between how, the focus on high-paying jobs in tech is a nice selling point for the industry. There's also an opportunity, I think, to highlight how does tech as an economic driver in terms of creating a large amount of economic output for the state help to also provide revenue to government so that they can provide the services that make this place attractive for people to live and work. So let's see here. What specific legislative actions is TAO supporting to enable a more diverse and inclusive tech industry in Oregon? That's a great question. So we did have a measure that came up this past summer, where there were a number of companies in the Portland area as well as in Eugene that had some issues with mainly BIPOC employees, and in particular Black employees who felt unsafe because of some of the social unrest and issues around police in communities in the state. And so what was interesting about this effort was a lot of the companies took more of a grassroots approach to how they formulated policies that they wanted to stand by as companies. So they talked to employee resource groups within their companies and asked them for recommendations on who in the community they should be talking to, what sort of principles they should put forth as a company. And so a bunch of employee resource groups across multiple companies said, here are the various community advocates that we should be paying attention to. And here are also some of the principles that we think would make sense here in terms of recommendations from a policy standpoint. So we worked with about 36 companies or so to come up with a common set of recommendations. Those were then submitted to state, local, and federal officials around police reform and also public safety measures. And I think that was interesting, both because it was one of the first sort of attempts that we've seen since I've been at TAO, where companies said, hey, we really care about and want to make a statement about racial justice and on behalf of our employees, because we think it's important. And then also it was an example of really kind of this grassroots employee-driven advocacy formulation. It wasn't just a bunch of lawyers and lobbyists and CEOs formulating what a company should stand for. It came from the employees. So I thought that was intriguing as well. All right.
Skip, I'll also note that there is a bill this session, I was trying to pull it up, but couldn't find it, around sort of the makeup of boards and increasing diversity there. I think that will be relevant to members and hopefully something that we can support. For sure. Yep. Yeah, that came up on a call we had actually last week, Rachel. And it's interesting, we've been tracking for a couple of years some of what our counterparts around the country are doing around board diversification, kind of at the top of companies. And one program in particular that's really interesting was put on by our counterpart in Massachusetts called Mass TLC. And Kara on our team, who leads a lot of our DEI work, has been studying that program and has met with the team there. And she's also heavily involved in Women on Boards, which is a national org with an Oregon presence. So we're trying to figure out what role do we play there? Do we continue to get tech folks involved in Women on Boards? Do we create our own program? So that's something that kind of separate from advocacy work, from a programmatic standpoint, we're definitely taking a close look at. I can take the first part of this. About promoting access through tech, can you expand on that again? I missed that part. No problem, and apologies for sort of running through things quickly. This is sort of a series of bills around sort of expanding access to healthcare through telehealth. Representative Prusak will be reintroducing her bill. We were supportive of that in the past. We'll continue to work on that issue. It's increasing access through sort of the encouragement of broadband, especially in rural Oregon. I think that there right now are 8 bills on broadband being considered this session, a lot of them focused in rural Oregon, recognizing the need for sort of internet access for those folks, especially if we're going to both encourage remote learning and remote access to healthcare. And then access to education, both making sure, I mean, I think we saw 2020 made sort of that technological divide very clear, making sure that God forbid we have to go back, should there be future pandemics, future reasons why virtual school is important and necessary, that people have the access that they need there, as well as focusing on career and technical education. TAO has supported this issue for a while now. There are several bills this session in sort of building on future past successes, encouraging school districts and the education department to prioritize this issue, and then sort of emphasis on workforce, things like that.
All right, it looks like we've exhausted questions. All right, any others that folks have as we, looks like we move to wrap up. All right, in terms of some of the pre-submitted questions, we hit a lot of these. So questions about data privacy legislation, tech infrastructure, specifically if there's anything related to remote work accommodations, allowances, or incentives. Rachel, are you seeing anything there in the 2,000 or so bills you've read in the last 24 hours?
I don't think I saw anything, but like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if some big issues don't pop up later on as folks sort of catch up and get their bills into shape to be introduced.
Well, it looks like we've got a couple of questions around, the focus on trade schools, high school graduation rates and education reform, and then some of the digital transformation stuff. Why is our unemployment system still built on COBOL, and what do you plan to do about it? Well, hopefully the Workforce Modernization Act that is being proposed this session gets some traction. That's something we'll be supporting, which should address that. Let's see here, what else?
Skip, I'll also note on that, I think part of the overall goal of increasing awareness of tech organizations in the state, and sort of there will TAO as a member organization will help those conversations, because as legislators express frustration about what happened at the unemployment department, as they sort of try to innovate within the agencies that their committees are in charge of, hopefully that they can turn to TAO and its members as a resource to help them do some brainstorming and some suggestion of fixes that will make things hopefully move smoother in the future. That's my
I apologize for the whistling in the background. That's my daughter, who is taking a break from her virtual schooling. But yeah, in terms of some of the digital modernization stuff, one thing that's been talked about that we'll be looking into and having conversations about is there some sort of almost like a tech advisory board that could be put together, or a council that could help advise either the state CIO and or the governor's office or multiple agency CIOs, kind of in an informal capacity. And we have a lot of resident subject matter expertise here. It'd be a shame to ignore it. One thing that I worked on when I was at the city of Portland was we created a citizen technology advisory group that consists of a handful of folks from tech, mainly CIOs, CTOs, that get appointed, and they advise the state or the city CTO on larger tech projects. And something could easily be put together. We'd be happy to support it. And that's something that we've had some conversations about. We'll see if we can get traction in the remainder of Governor Brown's term. All right, Rachel, thank you for your time. This is a very busy season. And thank you all in terms of the attendees who took time out of your busy schedules to join us today. This was an attempt to try and kind of blow open more widely some of our legislative priorities at the beginning of the session and make them widely available across all of our members and non-members as well. And so to the non-members who joined us, if you're interested in getting involved in TAO, this is a big part of the work that we do. And it's a chance to help shape outcomes across a variety of initiatives: education, workforce, talent, capital, and a variety of others, including tech infrastructure. So thank you all for joining us. Big thank you again to Rachel. And thank you to the TAO team, Justin Martinez, Kara Snow, who are on this call today. And we'll see you soon.